until 1941. And you had to have approval by both your parents to join if you were aged 18 to 20.
Oh.
And his parents wouldn't agree for him to go.
Yes.
So he waited till his 20th birthday and he rode his push bike about 30 miles.
Oh gosh.
About 45, about nearly 50 kilometres from the property that he lived on at the time, called Braemar, which is east of where Windogan is. It's about 10 mile, 25 kilometres, 20 kilometres east of Windogan. But he rode his push bike from there into Gilgandra and signed up the day after his 20th birthday. So that was the beginning of it. And then from there he went to Sydney and they marshalled all the recruits at the Sydney Showground. It was a big tent city on the Sydney Showground, and they managed all the new recruits there, and then they sent them off to training camps. And my dad he went to Tamworth, and they had about 6 weeks of intensive initial training. He was then given a week's leave, and he went home, and at that stage he'd been allocated to the 26th Battalion, and the 26th Battalion was due to go to Malaya, and he was part of the reinforcements. The 26th Battalion had gone to Malaya in about August, and they were active. They positioned themselves up the east coast of Malaya, and he was to join a group of reinforcements to go to Malaya. But when he got back to Sydney after leave, there was a bit of reorganisation, and he and some of the others got pulled out of the 26th and were allocated to the 2nd 13th Battalion, who were to be reinforcements to the Middle East. And that turned out to be probably a very lucky outcome, because the 2nd 26th that was in Malaya, the Japanese overran Malaya and Singapore, and the British surrendered, and all of those soldiers that were there became prisoners of war. So he avoided becoming a prisoner of war just through a sort of sleight of hand. He thought he was going to Malaya, but he finished up going to the Middle East. And then going to the Middle East, he'd heard, it was the 2nd 13th that he was allocated to, and the 2nd 13th they've already fought some battles in the Middle East, and they were involved in the capturing of Tobruk, and so it was a highly respected battalion to be part of. So he thought that was it. When he got to the Middle East, when he went to the Middle East, he travelled on the Queen Mary liner, which was a luxury British passenger liner that had been converted to a troop ship. And actually converted to a troop ship in Australia, would you believe? We had skills in those days to be able to sort of reconfigure a passenger liner into a troop ship back in the late 30s, early 40s. But anyway, and when they were going across the Great Australian Bight, there were some quite strong southerly winds, and the Queen Mary had a habit of going into a roll program, a routine in high seas, and so but Pa and some of his mates realised if you had a hammock, you could avoid getting seasick if you just parked yourself in a hammock. So he and his mates worked out how to survive getting seasick as they went across the Great Australian Bay. Then they went to the Middle East. He then had to do more training, or went into a training camp when he got to the Middle East, to Palestine. And in those days, Israel didn't exist. And so while he was in training camp, he went to Tel Aviv, which was in Palestine. He also went to Jerusalem, which was part of Palestine, when he was on leave at weekends. But then, when he finished his training, and he was looking forward to joining the 2nd 13th Battalion, they brought the second. They decided to bring the 2nd 13th back from Tobruk, and they decided they didn't need as many reinforcements for the 2nd 13th. So about half of the recruits that he was training with were allocated to the 2nd 13th, and the other half went to the 2nd. None of them really heard much about the 2nd Battalion. It was a bit of an unknown. It hadn't had a lot of publicity, but the 2nd had been actively involved in successful battles at Bardia, which is just to the western side of Tobruk. They were also involved in the Battle of Tobruk, and then they were then involved in the battles further north from Tobruk. So anyway, he got allocated to the 2nd, but in the meantime, the 2nd had been to Tobruk and beyond, and then they'd been withdrawn, and then they'd been sent to Greece, and it was a bit of a disaster in Greece. The British sent the Australians to Greece, not the British soldiers, because it was a high risk, and so that they actually had a couple of fairly successful major battles against the Germans in northern Greece, but then they were overrun, mainly because the German Air Force was very effective. The Brits had virtually no planes in Greece, so the Germans had control of the air, so the Germans were able to bomb them. But the 2nd Battalion basically got dissipated. About 2/3 of them got evacuated back to Palestine. The other third finished up in Crete, and some of them escaped, but then were captured and became prisoners of war. But that all happened before Pa actually arrived for his training in the Middle East. But nobody had heard much about what the 2nd Battalion had done and what they were involved in at that stage. But anyway, in January of 1942, he joined the 2nd Battalion, who had actually been involved in an active program in Syria. But they were withdrawn from that as part of an operation called Operation Stepsister, which was going to relocate Australian troops from the Middle East back to Singapore and Australia to meet the Japanese advance that was coming down from the north. The Japanese at that stage had captured the Philippines, and they were into Borneo and actively coming down the west side of Malaya. But and actually there were two advanced sections of the 2nd Battalion, including Weary Dunlop, who has had a lot of publicity. He was a surgeon, and he's had did a lot of reporting on the prisoner of wars program, what happened during the prisoner of war. But the medical section and the pioneer section from the 2nd Battalion were sent as part of an advance guard to Java to prepare ready for the arrival of the other, the 16th Division, over 3,000 troops that were being brought back, and they were going to be distributed to Singapore and Malaya and Java to protect Indonesia. But before the main body of the 6th Division departed the Middle East, the Japanese on their push bikes were successful in coming all the way down Malaya and were very effective in overcoming Singapore. Well, of course, the British were actually holding Singapore, but the British capitulated, and therefore the whole Malayan Peninsula and Singapore, all the Allied troops became prisoners of war. And the advance guard, the Japanese also at that time, then moved into Indonesia and captured Java. And the advance guard were only in Java for about 2 weeks before they were captured. And Weary Dunlop was part of that group. So in the meantime, the troops in the Middle East, including PAR, were loaded, and then they then went to Aden to start with stage 1, which is just at the bottom of the Suez Canal. And they sat there for several days while there was some argy-bargy going on between the British and the Australians as to whether these Australians should actually go to Burma or Ceylon, current day Sri Lanka. And what happened was about half of them were then shipped to Colombo in Ceylon, and the other half diverted back to Western Australia and came back to Australia. And then the second battalion, which PAR was part of, went to Ceylon, landed Colombo, and then they were put into defensive positions because it was thought the Japanese were going to attempt to invade Ceylon at that stage. The intelligence was they were preparing a convoy to come across from Borneo and Indonesia to capture Ceylon. But anyway, they set up defensive positions, and they'd only been there 2 weeks when the Japanese mounted their attack, and there was some bombing, but more importantly, what happened, the British fleet and the British Air Force, which was based, there were quite a number of fighter planes based in Colombo, and about 90 of those took to the air to bomb the Japanese fleet that was making for Colombo, and they were successful in taking out a significant number of the Japanese ships, but none of the British pilots returned. It was basically a one-way mission for them, but they were successful, and there was relatively light bombing. The Japanese that were coming off an aircraft carrier that were actually bombed Ceylon, but the Australians shot down one of the Japanese Zeros or bomber planes that were there, and but all of the locals were still unloading their ships at that stage. There was still a lot of equipment that still had to be offloaded from their ships. All the locals went bush. There were no stevedores available then to complete unloading the ship, so the call went out for volunteers to help unload the ships. Anyone that had stevedoring experience, and there were hundreds of arms went up. Everyone volunteered to go and unload the boats. And, they slipped a couple of vehicles that weren't loaded properly that finished up in the harbour, and a few guns that finished up in the harbour. But basically they got the ships unloaded, and in the meantime the locals started to come back quietly and eventually helped, and everything went. But they only stayed there for about 2 months, and at that stage, that was in July, and in the meantime the Japanese had actually bombed Port Moresby and Rabaul in Papua New Guinea, and at that stage, yes, had bombed Darwin, and so it was clear that Australia needed troops, their own troops back home to defend the country. So the group from Ceylon embarked, and then they sat in the harbour for 6 days, I think it was. Again, while I was argy-bargy with Churchill about where these troops were going. The British were arguing they should go to Burma and strengthen Burma so that the Japanese couldn't come across to India. And the Australian Prime Minister Curtin was arguing, no, we need them back here. We've got Japanese on our back doorstep. And anyway, the Finnish Curtin won, and they came home. They came home, were disembarked in Melbourne, and then they were given 2 weeks leave. And it just happened that they arrived in Melbourne. I think it was on the 4th of August. It was basically on Pa's birthday. But anyway, when he got home, and he would have had to have travelled by train to Sydney, and then to Dubbo, and then up on the Coonamble line to Gilgandra or Kirban probably to come across to get home. But when he got home, his mother had a birthday cake for him, his 21st birthday cake. He'd been away just for 12 months at that stage. So we're not sure whether he sent a telegram from Melbourne to say that he was coming on leave, or just how Granny knew that he was coming home. But anyway, there was a 21st birthday cake waiting for him when he got home. After the 2 weeks, they then all reassembled back in Sydney, and they did a major military parade through the streets of Sydney, and that was a huge event, sort of welcoming the troops back from the Middle East, who were then going to go and defend the country, probably in New Guinea. But most of the troops had been in the Middle East for nearly 2 years. And this is really the first major leave that had home leave. And so they were a bit surprised when they, 2 days later, from Sydney, they then got transported up to Greta, which is just west of Maitland, Newcastle in New South Wales, to an army camp there. And it was a built camp, so where they'd been living in tents, it was heaven. They had sort of a proper dormitories to sleep in. They had hot and cold water, proper showers, and so it was like Christmas for them. And then 2 days later, they were told they were catching the train at 2 o'clock the next morning to go to Brisbane, because they were on the way to New Guinea. And the old diggers weren't really happy about that, because they said, well, we've only just had 2 weeks and we're off again. But anyway, that's what happened. I got to Brisbane, and then had to sit on the wharf for 24 hours because the wharfies that were loading the ship realised they were loading ammunition and went on strike. They needed higher pay to be handling ammunition. So there was a bit of a standoff until they resolved the loading of the ship. John Adams, I think it was. But anyway, it was sort of a transport ship. It wasn't very comfortable. It had major holes, big holes that they just put scantling timber, probably cypress pine boards down on the floor, so they didn't have to sleep on the steel of the bottom of the hole. And there was just a single ladder that went in and out of the hole, so the boys spent most of their time where they could up on the deck, and it was and the cooks had to cook their meals on the deck, so it was all pretty crowded on the decks, and they had there were trucks and equipment on the deck as well, but it was all pretty crowded. But anyway, they went to first step to Townsville and reprovisioned at Townsville, and then there was I think there were 3 boats in the convoy, and one of them was quite slow, and they had to stop occasionally to let the slow ship catch up with them. But anyway, they finally got to Port Moresby. Got to Port Moresby, and they camped out at the end of what's now Jackson Airport, and that night it was bombed. So they had their first experience of bombing, although their camp wasn't bombed, but was close by. But that night it had been a payday, and they didn't know why they were being paid, because there was no canteen or anything for them to spend their money. But I think in those days they used to get 2 bottles of beer a week, so there was a beer issue. So the beers were nursed quite carefully that night in case there was further Japanese raids. They then moved out to a village called Koitaki, which was well, not a village. It was a rubber plantation, quite a big rubber plantation, but where the army had taken over and set up a camp. And there they were issued jungle greens. Finally, General Blamey had accepted that they needed to be in greens rather than khaki, because the first Australian soldiers that went up there were in khaki, and they were setting targets in the green jungle. And despite pleas from their commanders to be issued with camouflaged uniform, the Australian military chief said no, too expensive, you've got to stay in your khakis. But anyway, so some of them got khakis, others they had a process where they had a big boiling pot, and they had to put their khaki uniforms in the big boiling pot that was a big dye pot to convert them to jungle green. And then about a week later, about a week later, they'd only been in Papua New Guinea about a week, and they were then ordered to move forward, because what had happened, the Japanese had forced the Australians back along the Kokoda track to within about 40 kilometres of Port Moresby. They were back to the second ridge in the Owen Stanley Ranges. When you go into the ranges over in the Kokoda track, you go up over what they call Imita Ridge, which is the first major ridge, and then down and across, and then up the second big ridge called Iribaya. And the Japanese had pushed right back to Iribaya, and the Australians were dug in on Emitter Ridge, and there was a standoff. But in the meantime, the Japanese, probably fortunate, I think, the Japanese issued an order for their troops to withdraw because they were involved elsewhere. There was a big battle going in Guadalcanal and in the Solomon Islands. And they just fought, the Battle of the Coral Sea had just been fought, and they'd been unsuccessful there in being able to get round to Port Moresby. And they had also lost the Battle of Milne Bay, which is right on the southeast corner tail of Papua New Guinea. So they weren't able to provide more reinforcements for General Horry, who was the commander of the Japanese advance party, and they instructed him to withdraw. And that was probably pretty fortunate for the Australians. But the Australians have been probing the Japanese that were holding the position on Iribaya, but the Japanese left a very effective rear guard, and the Australians still believed the Japanese were on Iribaya. And then the next day, they sent out scouts. The next time they sent out scouts, they found there was no Japanese resistance. And so they got to Iribaya and found that the Japanese had vacated. So the Japanese went into retreat, and the Australians at Iribaya moved forward. And then at that stage, the second battalion at that stage had basically arrived in Papua New Guinea. The troops at Iribaya moved forward, at Emitter Ridge moved forward to Iribaya, to Nauru, and then followed down the Kokoda track, basically without any real resistance. There were a few sniping exercises and a few booby traps on the track, but the Japanese withdrew about halfway back to Templeton's Crossing, or just before Templeton's Crossing. There was the Myala Lakes where there was some open kunai grass country, swampy kunai grass country, which the Australians used as a major airdropping point to resupply the troops, because there's no roads across the Allan Standards. It's a small track and very slippery and muddy, and lots of tree roots. So everything had to be brought in, either carried in or carried in by what they call the fuzzy wuzzies. So a lot of New Guinea natives were seconded to work for the Australians, and they became very effective, and they got to be named the Fuzzy Wuzzy Angels because of the way in which the care that they took in extracting the wounded Australians back from the front line to a point where they could be evacuated either by air from Myala or put on further stretchers and walked out. But the Kokoda track is about 96 kilometres long. And Templeton's Crossing, it's roughly about halfway, a little bit more than halfway along the track. But anyway, the existing troops moved forward, and then the 6th Division, including the 2nd Battalion, then started to move up and move behind with the view to becoming reinforcements to take over from the advance group of Australians that was pushing forward. And it was round at Templeton's Crossing where the 6th Division battalions took over from the 9th Division, and that's where Parr saw his first action. But there's two Templeton's Crossing creeks. The first creek is sort of just below the high. It's quite high, and you go across it. And as they were crossing it, Two of their men were shot. There was a sniper on the other side of the creek. It was a prime spot to have a sniper or to ambush. And so the Australians had to find another crossing further down. But Dad and a couple of his mates stayed behind because one of the guys that was wounded couldn't get himself out. He was shot in the thigh, and he managed to park himself in behind a rock to protect himself from the sniper. And then Dad and this other soldier had to wait until after dark, or quite well after dark, before they could go in and rescue him, because they knew the sniper was still there. But they got him out successfully, and that was the first, not shooting action, but it was a rescue action that he was involved in. The next day, and then that night they moved down in position with the rest of them at Templeton's Crossing number 1, and the Japanese had dug in, had quite a significant, were dug in quite significantly, just to the north of Templeton's Crossing, on either side of the track, and the 9th Division and 3rd Battalion they'd probed them, but hadn't been able to make any indents on them. So the 6th Division was called up to reinforce or to take over from the 9th Division troops, and the second Battalion was one of the groups that were given responsibility to do a manoeuvring position, and they had to go up, and the Eora Valley at that stage is quite steep, and the track, the creek. And during the war, there was a lot of water because it was a wet spring, and there was a lot of water in the creek. But the track sort of went along basically parallel to the Eora Creek, and then up and over a couple of spurs that came down, and the Japanese were ensconced on the spur, and the second Battalion, 3 companies were given the task of going up the hill and round behind these 2 spurs to come in on a downward pincer movement on each of the 2 spurs, and that's where Pa saw his first real action. And the Australians, they were successful in capturing a couple of machine gun positions, and the next morning they found the Japanese had withdrawn back to Eora Creek village. And then there was then a major initiative at Eora Creek, because on the other side of Eora Creek, basically it's all nearly a cliff face. It's a very steep feature on the other side, and the Japanese were well ensconced in there with their machine guns, and they had a couple of mountain guns which Australians didn't have, but they had really good vision down onto the Australians. And the Australians, the experienced Australians said to their commanders, we've got to do a pincer movement here, we've got to go in behind them. But at that stage, Blaney and General MacArthur was also involved. He was head of the Pacific activities and basically in charge of directing Blaney, the Australians, what to do. And he kept saying the Australians are not making enough progress, they're not moving quickly enough. We need to get them moving quicker. And there was a lot of pressure down the line from the senior military staff to make the Australians attack and keep moving quickly. And the local commanders were bluffed, and they sent quite a few of the troops in to try and do a frontal on this feature, and there were a lot of Australians killed in that action. And they finally agreed that yes, maybe we need to do this pincer movement around to the left, which the experienced soldiers, it said this is what we need to do, and they did that. But again, just as everything was in place and they initiated that activity, the Japanese had decided to withdraw, and there was only a handful. Well, the Japanese were in the process of withdrawing when the Australians launched the position to take the Eora feature. But again, they were successful and they chased the remaining Japanese out, and then pursued them down the track to Kokoda. At Allan, the track splits, and the one track goes straight ahead to Kokoda, and the other track goes down to Amuri on the other side of the Eora Creek and runs parallel down towards Oivi. And half of the Australian troops went straight ahead to Kokoda. The other half went down and went ahead in the valley towards Oivi. The lead group basically took Kokoda without any casualties. There was a small rearguard of Japanese there, but they scarpered. But what the Australians didn't know was that the Japanese had another major dig-in at Oivi, and the two Australian forces then were out of food, they were hungry, and they were working with the villagers to get whatever they could from the local village gardens to have something to eat. And so the Australians halted their advance until they were resupplied, and they moved into an area where there was a big kunai patch, and they flew. They had an airdrop into that kunai grass, and for the first time they were issued some American rations, not just bully beef and dry biscuits, which was basically the Australian ration. It was an 8-pack ration. It had chocolate and sweets and a whole range of combination of foods, soft foods, spaghetti and spam rather than bully beef. And the Australians thought this was pretty good. They all tucked in, and of course all finished up with melly belly then the next day, because they were used to bully beef and biscuits, a really rough ration, and when they got these soft American rations, their stomach couldn't handle them, so they had terrible problems with dysentery for a few days. But anyway, they regrouped and moved forward, and the headquarters group that was with Dad's group, the second, weren't happy with how quickly the troops were moving, because the troops didn't know where the Japanese were, and they did proper military strategy. They had a couple of scouts out the front, and they'd move and then give the all clear, and then the troops would move up and the scouts would go out again. And the headquarters group, no, there's no Japanese here, and they moved through the scout group and moved forward. And of course it was only about 10 minutes after they moved through, the Australians hear the machine gun fire, and immediately there's a runner comes back and says, "Oh, we've been ambushed. We need to be rescued." So the second battalion then had to organise a couple of patrols very quickly to make their way out strategically to protect or recapture, if you like, the Australian the battalion headquarters group who'd gone forward sort of under their own steam, listening to. They didn't want to be called out, a bit like Trump. You get called out, you lose your position, because there've already been three commanders at that stage had been sacked because the Australians weren't making good progress. So the commanders that were there were under a lot of pressure to be seen to be doing the right thing, so Blamey and MacArthur wouldn't demand their heads. But anyway, they rescued the headquarters group, and they came back with the tail between their legs and took their correct position behind the formation, and everyone moved forward. And of course then, where they'd run into the machine guns, the Japanese were entrenched. They cleared that group of Japanese and then moved forward and then hit an even bigger resistance, which also had mountain gun support. And they then they did a couple of pincer movements on them, but couldn't make any headway because the Japanese were really well entrenched in this feature at Oivi. So at that stage, the Australian commander decided to split the group in two, and he took half the group further east and well around the back of Oivi to cut off the tail end of Kokoda Track, which goes back towards Popondetta and the coast. And they were successful in cutting that off or making progress. There was some Japanese resistance at the village, but they took them out. And then the following morning, the Australians, the second boys, they normally had what they called a hate session every morning. They'd fire off a few shots and a few mortars, and they'd exchange. The Japanese would bounce back at them. Nothing happened. So they then went forward, and they found the Japanese had evacuated overnight. And they found that they'd used vines and candles in tins that had the side cut out of them, so that the candle, you could see the candle from the one side, but not the other side. So any Australians that might have been in the area wouldn't have been able to see the candle line that they followed they set up for their escape route. And then they had vines also that they used to assist with their escape route. They then escaped right back to what they call Comissi River. It's quite a wide river, about 300 feet wide, 100 metres wide. And it was partially in flood. And a lot of Japanese were drowned as they attempted to cross that, because they were relied on, they had flying foxes. You couldn't, some of them, they had some canoes, but the canoes would get washed down. General Horry went in a canoe and got washed out, and he eventually got drowned further down the river because he couldn't make shore successfully. So there were a lot of Japanese left there. They left a lot of ammunition, a lot of equipment on their escape to the coast. The Australians then moved down. They had a day's R&R before they moved across. But they had flying foxes, and then they had a rope river, a rope bridge, which is pretty crude. If you look at it, you have an overhead rope and tree logs strung together, and you sort of they had two ropes, a rope either side, and a line of logs across that you had to go across. But the river rose and that got washed away before the second battalion could get across, and the second battalion all had to go across on flying foxes, and they started going across at 11 o'clock at night, and by 8 o'clock the next morning they had everyone across. And then it was basically a forced march to the coast, because the Japanese had withdrawn to the coast. They didn't know where they were, but it was basically a chase that was on. And again, the Australians are short on food, and they'd all been on the track now for nearly 2 months. So there's a lot of exhaustion, but they had, it was basically a forced march that they did to the coast. and they split the group. One lot was going to Buna, the other lot was going to Sananandra. They got to Popondetta, and they met up with the Americans, because the Americans had been brought into the operation at this stage. And just as an aside, MacArthur had been very critical about the Australians and how they performed on the Kokoda track, and he'd sent a battalion across what they call the Kappa Kappa track, which is further south, a shorter track, and he was going to show the Australians how to do it. But the Americans got lost on the way over. They lost 2 or 3 men that slid down steep slopes and incurred injuries that meant they couldn't be evacuated. They died before they were able to get them out. And basically, when they arrived at the other end, they arrived not where they were supposed to, because MacArthur was going to chop off the Kokoda track, use this battalion to chop off the Kokoda track and capture the Japanese, and the Americans would be the winners of the exercise. But they finished up about 20 kilometres away from where they were originally designed or designated to arrive at. And then basically they were all put into convalescence for 3 months. None of those blokes were involved in the action that followed. But the Australians moved forward to Popondetta, and they met up with a group of Americans that had been flown in, and the Americans said, "Oh, you guys can go home. We've got it under control, boys." And the Australians said, "Oh, righto, well, yeah, you guys go and do your thing. We'll do ours." And anyway, the Australians then moved ahead. They got to Popondetta, and I think from Popondetta to Saputo, and Saputo is only about 10 kilometres to the coast from Saputo, and they were basically told they needed to be at Popondetta. That was the day's march. They were going to march right through to the coast, not knowing where the Japanese were. And of course, just east of Saputo, boom, 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 and there the Japanese are dug in. It's a really swampy area. Some Kuno grass areas, but a lot of swamp, low lying. Some patches of jungle. Very difficult areas to fight in. But anyway, for the next 22 days, the second battalion, PAR included, basically dug in and challenged the Japanese there to try and make headway. And in the meantime, they brought in other reinforcements who then, the Americans attempted to go back behind them, and one group was successful in getting behind, but then got isolated. That became known as the Huggins roadblock. The Japanese surrounded them. But there was a lot of activity there for the next really 21 days. I think PAR was in the front line. And the water table was about 18 inches deep, so they couldn't dig deep foxholes. And a lot of the guys got really bad feet, fungus feet, because their feet were in water or wet all of the time. When they were to deliver food rations to where they were, the guys. They had to wade to get to their positions. A lot of them had to wade through swamps, chest deep swamps to get into a defensive position. But anyway, they were successful in holding the Japanese, and the Japanese weren't able to advance. But they were just, the Australians that were there first were just slowly disintegrating. You can't sleep very much when you've got on the front line, and there was a lot of disease, a lot of malaria. A lot of the guys, a significant number, were being withdrawn, but the soldiers wouldn't. They were told to withdraw as soon as they had a temperature, but none of them withdrew until their temperature went over 108. At 108, they would finally capitulate and say, yeah, well, okay, we'll go. But there's a lot of camaraderie. When you're in a group like that, yeah, you work as a team, as a group. And you don't like to leave your mates behind if you've got to go out, even if you're sick. But anyway, they finally got enough reinforcements in, and they withdrew the second Battalion and the second, 3rd Battalion from the front line back to Saputo. When they got back to Saputo, Pa was diagnosed as being a serious malaria case, and they had what they call a casualty clearing station. That's the first medical post behind the front line, and they then determined that he was serious. He needed to be aerial evacuated to Port Moresby. The next day, he was put on a jeep and up to Popondetta, up to the airport at Popondetta. The previous day, there'd been a lot of military activity, and there were about 600 wounded at one stage, lined up along on stretchers along the side of the airport. The previous day, fortunately, late in the afternoon, they were able to get planes away, and they got over 200 of those out, and the next morning they got another 200 out. When Pa got there were probably at least 200 soldiers, with wounded soldiers that were ahead of him, lined up, and they were loading up a plane when his ambulance arrived, and his ambulance arrived sort of close to the end of the runway where they were loading this plane, and they were loading a stretcher, and the orderlies identified that the stretcher had a dead man on it, a dead soldier. So they called for another stretcher. I unloaded that one and called for another stretcher, and the blokes that were unloading Pa just basically wheeled him straight onto the plane. When he got to Port Moresby, they realised that he had malaria, he had dengue fever, and he also had scrub typhus. And during the war, in those early days, if you got scrub typhus on the front line, your chances of survival were pretty low. So he was really lucky that he was able to get a medical evacuation. There was also another little medical anomaly. If you had both dengue fever and scrub typhus, there was a very high percentage of those people, those soldiers, actually survived scrub typhus. So that might have been another factor that sort of helped Pa. But then from Port Moresby, they decided he's too sick to keep in Papua New Guinea. He was then aerial evacuated back to Australia, back to Townsville, and then back to Brisbane, and then he finished up in Toowoomba, and he spent about 2.5 months in hospital in Toowoomba. He then went on leave for a couple of weeks, and then reported sick to the Dubbo military barracks with malaria, and he was there medically evacuated to Sydney, where he spent quite some time, and then several months. He then eventually got, in the meantime, the 2nd Battalion had been withdrawn back to Australia at Christmas time, and then sent to the Atherton Tableland to rehabilitate and retrain, continue their jungle training. He then was repatriated to his battalion on the Atherton Tableland. After he went back, he had a number of further bouts of malaria where he went back into hospital up there for a week or 2 weeks at a time. But almost 2 years, it was nearly another was about 20 months after he came back before he was properly well again, where he wasn't having relapses of malaria. But anyway, they retrained on the Atherton tableland for over 12 months, 18 months, nearly 2 years, before he went back to New Guinea for a second round. And at that stage, the Americans were being organised to make an assault on the Philippines, and the Americans had occupied a number of spots along the northern coast of New Guinea. Wewak and Tepe were two areas where there were big concentrations of about 30,000 Japanese in the hinterland. The Americans were holding them at bay, but they weren't actively chasing them. But anyway, when the Americans decided to go, they were going to assault the Philippines. The Australians then put troops in to replace the Americans, and PAR was part of the group that went to Tepe with the 6th Division. There were about 10,000 troops, Australian troops, put in there, I think, given they were expecting, they'd estimated there were about 30,000 Japanese in the area that had to be cleared out. And the Australian attitude was to clear the Japanese out, not to leave them sit. The Americans they believed they could just starve them out, but they were still getting airdrops, and they were very effective working with the natives to live off the land. They were getting a lot of food from the native village gardens. So the Australians took the approach that they would actively rout out the Japanese, so that it was an offensive program that was involved there. And they basically set up a big sweep from Tepe and just moved east or southeast down the coast towards Wewak, which they did successfully. When they got to Wewak, there was a group inland, and PAR was part of the group that went inland, and there was some fairly stiff opposition with the Japanese as they moved inland, and part of the there was the first VC, Australian VC in Papua New Guinea, was awarded as part of that initiative, and then a little later on, PAR was involved in a heavy skirmish up a very narrow razorback ridge to a little village on the top, and he was sergeant at that stage, and he was ordered. His section was ordered to take this village, and he, being the sergeant, he was supposed to send some of his troops in to take the village, and he was of the opinion that he couldn't ask somebody to do something he wasn't prepared to do. And so he got the Tommy gun and loaded himself up with grenades, and he charged up the hill, followed by his other members of his platoon, charged up a gun emplacement, and was successful in clearing the Japanese out. I think he was attributed of killing 4 of the Japanese in the pit, and I think there were about another 20 that scarpered out of it. And but anyway, his group moved forward, and then there was another platoon behind them, and collectively they then captured the village, which was their objective. And out of that, PAR was awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, and that really is number 2. There's the VC, the Victoria Cross, and then there's the DCM. So it was a pretty significant piece of bravery on his part. But in the books, if you boys are interested, it's the full description of the citation. And then they continued to pursue the Japanese. And that happened on his birthday, the 4th of August. That happened. That was quite a significant date. And they kept then pursuing the Japanese until about the 15th of August, 14th of August, 15th. So the first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, I think, on the 14th of August. And the Australians then were told to ease off. They expected the Japanese would capitulate. And then 2 days later, I think they dropped the second one. And then the Australians circulated or put up a lot of signs for the Japanese because they weren't sure that the Japanese would have heard what had happened in Japan, and they told them the war was over on these posters. But the Japanese kept probing the Australian front, but the Australians were told, just be defensive, don't kill anyone, and make sure you don't get killed. And for several days after the official surrender of Japan, the frontline troops were still engaged in little skirmishes against each other. But the Australians, fortunately, nobody got killed, and I don't think they killed anyone. And so the war finished, and then they withdrew to Wewak. All the troops withdrew to Wewak. And then they had in the middle of October was a big surrender ceremony where the leader of the Japanese forces was forced to surrender, to hand over his sword on the airport at Wewak, and Pa was one of the group of Australian soldiers that were able to sort of witness that process happening. And then after that happened, they then sat around for another couple of weeks, and then all expecting eventually to be shipped out. And then there was a call to arms. So the 2nd Battalion had to put together a company of attack force capability, fully equipped and supplied to move out within 24 hours. And Pa got selected as part of that group, as they called the Milwaukee campaign, and that was basically a peacekeeping campaign. And they were taken to southern New Guinea, where there was some emerging conflict between the surviving Dutch, and they were basically Indonesian natives in that part of New Guinea. But because there'd been an Australian airport there was a big ammunition dump, a lot of ammunition, and the Dutch were worried that they were going to be overrun by the Indonesian natives. So the Australians were flown in. They were told that to expect there could be hostilities happening when they arrived, but none of them were told before they got on the plane. Only the platoon leaders were told just before they left what the campaign was. It was all top secret. What it was and what they had to do when they arrived. And when they had to arrive, they had to exit the planes, fully prepared to secure the aerodrome. So they all rolled out of the plane at the end of the runway and scattered around the perimeter of the airport to make sure everything was good. Fortunately, there weren't any atrocities happening at that stage. They then spent about a month there, became very friendly. They found the natives were quite friendly. When they first arrived, they set up a very secure camp because they didn't know what was happening. And then the Dutch put up their hand and they wanted to come behind the Australian lines. And the Australian commander said, sorry, these guys have just come out of 4 months frontline service. And we can't be here protecting you people all the time. We're not prepared to take responsibility to bring you into our group and manage you. We're sort of basically still in survival, recuperation mode. And the commander said to them, the best thing, if you're concerned about your safety, you shouldn't be here. And lo and behold, next morning, Catalina aircraft comes in, and the 20 or 30 Dutch boarded the Catalina, disappeared, and everything was quiet from there. But the Australians then went ahead. They had some big fireworks displays with blowing up the ammunition dumps, and it became quite friendly with the natives. Were pretty keen on horse racing, and the Australians, obviously some of the guys in the group were keen on horse racing and bought into the horse syndicates and had a few successful horse races. They had a big soccer match, an international soccer competition, the expats versus the locals, and a few things like that. And then eventually, after about a month, they then withdrawn to Australia. The battalion was disbanded, and some of the soldiers went to other units. Pa went to the salvage unit in Sydney, and then he was selected as part of the Australian victory contingent, part of about 120 Australian soldiers that went to London to march in the victory contingent celebrations in London, and there were airmen, soldiers and naval officers that went to London as part of that group. He was part of that group. They went on the Shropshire, an Australian battleship, well, not battleship, but it was a military ship, navy ship, but they stripped it right down, and they had to fill it up where it used to carry ammunition. They filled it up with food, because they had to be self-sufficient, because at that stage Great Britain was still under food rationing. There was a major shortage of food in Europe and Great Britain, so they had to be fully self-sufficient on their expedition while they were in London and then back again. When they were in London, they established a tent camp in Kensington Gardens, and while they were there, Pa he was also selected as part of he conducted a guard at Buckingham Palace. So he was part of a guard contingent. So they had little activities to keep them occupied while they were in London. And then he had a couple of weeks leave before they came home. And he then did a tour through England and up round through Scotland, to where his grandparents came from before he came back to Australia. So that's Pa's potted story after about an hour, probably. But what I've over the last probably 12 months, I've been just spending a little bit of time putting a story together, and most of that story is now in this book, which is I've just printed it out as a first copy, and I've circulated it to family members so they can have a look at it and tweak their memories to get some additional stories to put in. Because I haven't got it all, and we've got some additional snippets to put into what I had in originally. And there's also another fellow from the second Battalion who's written a book whereof his family live in Yass, and I've been trying to get hold of a copy of his book to see if there are any overlapping stories that we might be able to sort of share. But eventually there'll be, you've got the PDF of this one.
Yeah, because
But we'll do an update on that one and do a printed version for you.
Because all of your printed books like that, do you still have them so we could get
PDFs.
The PDFs of the
or like all of the other types of ones, like you did one
all of the travel books that we've done, yes.
No, but
About
how like,
Nan and
you know how
Oh,
they did
Nan,
one?
yes,
Nan.
Nan's book, yes. Yeah, so we can get you a copy of those.
We might just
Now,
make
give
it-
you a hard copy of that one, Ben?
No, we took it, we had a hard copy to take to Auntie Jen when we were going down one.
Oh, right,
Yeah.
okay.
We might just want a few little tweaks. Can they be tweaked?
You can do PDFs.
Yeah.
No, before it's printed.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I'll have a, I've got a PDF of those that I can.
they'll be on your blurb.